Once upon a time, in the northern drylands of Burkina Faso, the only sound that traveled across the wind was the crack of gunfire. Villages stood empty, markets lay in ashes, and even the birds forgot their songs. But listen now, can you hear it? The low hum of a water pump, the laughter of children chasing goats, the gentle rhythm of life returning. Where fear once ruled, footsteps are coming home. This is not just a political story. It is a story of resurrection. A story about soil, sweat, and the stubborn will to survive. And at its heart stands a man who believes peace is not a declaration, but a daily act. Captain Ibrahim Traore. So lean in, my brothers and sisters, because tonight, we're not talking about power. We're talking about purpose. We're not counting borders. We're counting blessings. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe because what you're about to hear isn't just a report. It's a sermon of survival, a testimony of what it means to rebuild life from the dust. For nearly a decade, Burkina Faso's northern frontier had been a wasteland of fear. Roads once used for trade became trails of smoke. Villages whispered only in the dark, afraid that a single voice might summon death. The land was not empty. It was haunted. Haunted by what had been lost: safety, trust, the small, ordinary moments that make life human. Then, in 2022, a soldier stepped forward, not with grand speeches, but with a simple creed. Peace is not a slogan, it is a mother sleeping without fear. That man was Captain Ibrahim Traore. This was his Ibrahim Traore moment, when the world first looked up from its headlines and saw a leader who spoke the language of dignity instead of diplomacy. He understood one truth that every farmer already knew: no seed grows in terror. Without security, there can be no harvest, no classroom, no homecoming. So his first mission was not to draft new constitutions, but to reclaim the soil itself, the living ground beneath a frightened nation. Traore's vision unfolded like a map of discipline and mercy. He built 2 layers of protection: the rapid intervention battalions, swift, specialized forces trained to strike and withdraw with precision, and the mobile intervention units, police and gendarmerie, who remained after the smoke cleared, sharing meals, mediating disputes, rebuilding faith. One force fought to win ground. The other stayed to make that ground livable. Together they created what villagers now call human terrain control, not the control of territory by flag, but the control of fear by familiarity. In provinces such as Barcelogo, Gabu, and Boucle du Mouhoun, the transformation began quietly. Markets reopened under mango trees where schools once stood empty. Women walked to the wells unguarded. Children carried slates instead of sacks. And the silence, once heavy with danger, began to hum again with life. Western commentators, from comfortable studios far away, called this militarization. They spoke of democracy delayed, of strong men rising. But they did not stand at the crossroads of Tamasgo when a returning farmer said, "I would rather have a soldier at the road than a gunman in my field." That single sentence was heavier than any editorial, because for those who had fled, protection was not oppression, it was presence. It meant someone was finally staying. By 2025, 28 rapid intervention battalions were stationed across Sahel, Nord, and Center Nord. Checkpoints became corridors of trade instead of fear. Humanitarian convoys rolled again. Goats bleated along newly safe tracks. And behind every patrol, a deeper mission pulsed to make safety ordinary. Yet the captain knew that victory on the battlefield is hollow without victory in the heart. He reminded his officers, "A soldier who protects a farmer plants more than a seed, he plants trust." So the troops were instructed not merely to defend, but to dwell, to help rebuild bridges, repair wells, even teach literacy at night. It was not the image of a conquering army, it was the image of a neighbor in uniform. Still, the cost of peace is patience. Border regions near Mali and Niger remained volatile. Mistakes and excesses could undo months of effort. But even cautious observers admitted something tangible was shifting. More than 1 million internally displaced people had chosen to return, not forced, but willing. They came back because they sensed a different kind of authority, one that did not roar from podiums, but whispered through the rhythm of daily safety. This was the rebirth of presence, the smell of dust after rain, the first call to prayer in a mosque once silenced by fear. Burkina Faso's pulse was faint, but it was beating again. And yet, as Captain Traore often said, security is the beginning, not the destination. Because once a mother can sleep, she will wake to feed her child. Once a road is safe, a farmer will plant. Once a field is planted, a nation must decide what to grow: fear or food. The guns have quieted, the roads are open, and the soil waits. But what grows next will decide whether this peace becomes permanent or perishes. When the sound of gunfire fades, another silence begins, the silence of empty stomachs. Peace without bread is a fragile thing. And so, once the roads were safe, the next battle began, the battle to feed a people returning home to dust. In the heart of Burkina Faso's new recovery, President Ibrahim Traore made a promise that startled his critics and stirred his citizens. He declared that sovereignty begins with food, not speeches. This, he said, was not politics, it was survival with dignity. It was the soil speaking back to the world. Across the Sahel, Nord and Center-Nord regions, fields long abandoned began to breathe again. Women cleared the weeds from parched plots. Men repaired irrigation ditches with their bare hands. And from the presidency came a national blueprint, the offensive agro-pastoral et halieutique 2003, a plan that reached far beyond slogans. 8 pillars of production were named: rice, maize, tubers, meat and livestock, poultry, fisheries, wheat and mangoes, the 8 engines of renewal. Nearly $1 billion in local currency, 592 billion CFA francs, were set aside. The goals were audacious: 100,000 jobs for youth and returning families, an 11% rise in agricultural output, a 5% lift for the nation's economy. But the figures were only the frame. The real story lived in the fields where farmers, many of them displaced for years, placed their first handful of seed into a land they had once feared to walk. The government's approach was practical. First came water repairing wells and canals so the rain could stay. Then came tools and seed delivered through local cooperatives. And when the first sprouts broke through, hope followed. This was not imported charity. This was homegrown courage. The change reached even the schoolyard. For decades, foreign ships had carried grain to the ports of West Africa, food that filled stomachs but emptied local markets. Now the World Food Program itself turned a new page through its homegrown school feeding scheme. Instead of shipping rice across oceans, it bought millet and maize from village cooperatives. Local women cooked the meals. Local children ate them. Local farmers sold their harvests with pride. The school became more than a classroom. It became a small engine of the national economy. And through it all, Traoré repeated his creed. Sovereignty starts with food, not speeches. That line, the Ibrahim Traoré reaction that echoed far beyond Ouagadougou, was more than rhetoric. It was defiance shaped like hope. For a nation whose people once starved in the shadow of terror, feeding oneself had become an act of resistance. Critics abroad muttered about centralization, about state control, about isolation. They wrote in polished reports that Burkina Faso might be turning inward. But the farmers did not read those reports. They read the soil, and the soil was saying, grow. In Arbolé, Bassi, and Borba districts, school cooks stirred pots filled with local maize and lentils. In Boucle du Mouhoun, returning families harvested their first rice in 5 seasons. In Gabou, women formed seed banks under the shade of neem trees. Every sack of millet sold in an open market became a declaration of self-belief. One farmer said, "We no longer wait for ships, we wait for rain." Another, a widow who had fled to the south and now returned, said, "I planted again because the soldiers stayed." The preacher in me hears something divine in that rhythm. Security births trust, trust births labor, and labor births bread. This is how nations heal, not in conference halls, but in furrows of earth. Still, challenges rise like dust after plowing. The climate is harsh, the rains uncertain, and skeptics in far-off capitals still watch through the lens of ideology, not intimacy. Yet the truth remains. Burkina Faso is feeding itself again. Not perfectly, not entirely, but genuinely. Because sovereignty without sustenance is only a flag in the wind. And in these fields, that flag is being sown with seed and sweat. But seeds alone cannot feed a nation unless the animals return to graze. And when the goats and cattle came home, they carried with them not just milk and meat, but the promise of continuity. In the villages of Burkina Faso, before a child speaks, they learn the sound of animals, the bleat of a goat, the lowing of cattle, the rooster's cry at dawn. These are not mere noises. They are the rhythm of survival, the heartbeat of a household. So when the animals disappeared during the years of war, something deeper vanished too. Dignity. That is why, once the seeds had taken root, President Ibrahim Traoré turned his attention home to the herds. He knew that every goat carried a future herd, and every herd carried a family's hope. And so, in what some call the most practical miracle of the recovery, the government launched the Livestock Resettlement Kit program. These were not handouts. They were building blocks, structured packages for families returning home. Each kit included 1 male and 2 female goats, or for larger households, a cow and a bull. Alongside them came bags of feed to last until the rains, vaccination vouchers, and training in basic veterinary care. It was not charity. It was investment, simple, direct, human. In Barcelogo and Gabou, the first kits arrived on trucks accompanied not by speeches, but by veterinarians. Children clapped, elders wept, and for the first time in years, the bleating of goats filled the air. It was as if the land itself exhaled. One elderly man told a reporter, "When the goats returned, so did my reason to wake up." That may sound small to some, but for those who have known displacement, that is resurrection. The program expanded quickly. Veterinary teams partnered with the FAO to launch a nationwide vaccination campaign against foot and mouth disease in 2025. It began in Pobra and rolled across the provinces like a quiet army of healers, protecting the nation's new herds before they could fall to sickness. And this time, protection was followed by production. Burkina Faso, once known for exporting live animals, now dared to dream of exporting finished goods. With support from the African Development Bank, construction began on a modern meat processing and cold chain facility in Bobo Dioulasso. It would employ 30,000 workers, herders, butchers, technicians linking the rural field to the urban plate. For the president, this was more than economics. It was theology in action, the gospel of work. He said during a 2024 visit to Barcelona, "In every goat is a future herd. In every herd, a future market. Our recovery begins with hoof prints in the dust." And so it did. In the once abandoned valleys of Tamasco, families formed new cooperatives. Women led grazing schedules, children helped carry feed, and young men were trained as vaccinators. Each animal became a classroom, each household a small enterprise. Where once aid convoys brought tins of imported food, now local trucks carried milk and meat from village to town. Even aid organizations began buying from local producers, feeding schools with the same animals once given as resettlement kits. The circle was complete. Relief had turned into resilience. To an outsider, it might look modest: a few goats, some grass, a new facility. But to those who had lost everything, it was transformation you could touch. Because recovery is not about what governments give. It is about what people can build with it. Of course, challenges remain. Water access during the dry months is fragile, and pastures can wither overnight. But hope has its own ecosystem. When a farmer sells a calf to pay school fees, when a widow trades milk for medicine, that is the economy of endurance. Western analysts often overlook this quiet revolution, preferring the language of macroeconomics. But as one village elder said, statistics don't sing lullabies, goats do. And maybe that's what the world has missed about Burkina Faso's rebirth. It is not powered by conferences or grand summits, but by the sound of small herds moving home, by the sight of smoke from evening fires, by the laughter of children counting new kids born after the rains. This is how you measure peace, not by the absence of war, but by the presence of milk. And in that measure, Burkina Faso is slowly, steadily, profoundly healing. Tell me, have you ever seen recovery begin with a goat? Drop your thoughts below. Yet even a healthy herd can stumble if the family behind it falls ill or falls unseen. And so the next battle would not be fought with rifles or rations, but with registration, support, and care, the social net beneath the nation. You can rebuild a house, but unless you rebuild the system that sustains it, the walls will fall again. That is why, after the goats had returned and the fields had bloomed, the government of Burkina Faso turned to something even more enduring: structure. Because peace without protection is fragile, and income without insurance is fleeting. To make recovery real, it had to rest on pillars that could hold the weight of ordinary lives. Those pillars were 3 RSU, PAMPV, and RAMU. 3 letters, 3 lifelines. The Registre Social Unique, or RSU, is where everything begins. It is not a speech or a ceremony. It is a number, a name in a database that says, you exist, and the state sees you. For families returning to villages wiped clean by war, that number means access to aid, to cash, to care. No more duplication, no more confusion, no more invisible citizens. One identity, one doorway. Once registered, people move to the second pillar, PAMPV, the Programme d'appui aux personnes vulnérables. It provides small but powerful cash transfers to vulnerable households, especially widows, single mothers, and displaced persons. But it is more than money. It is permission to start again. A woman can buy feed for her goats, repair her roof, reopen her market stall. For her, it is not assistance, it is agency. Then comes the third pillar, RAMU, the Universal Health Insurance Scheme, because illness can erase progress faster than any drought. Through RAMU, families receive access to clinics and medicine without selling their livestock or sliding back into poverty. It turns healing into a right, not a privilege. These three programs, RSU, PAMPV, RAMU, are not miracles. They are mechanics. They make recovery measurable, traceable, tangible, and perhaps most importantly, they change the direction of dependency. Instead of waiting for convoys of aid trucks, citizens now look to their own systems and find them working. President Ibrahim Traore said it clearly. A return without support is a return to risk. But when the state stands beside its people, not with words but with systems, we do more than rebuild, we restart. Already the results speak louder than politics. In Seno and Boucle du Mouhoun, families registered under RSU report higher school attendance, better livestock retention, and fewer cases of emergency hunger. Clinics in rural zones now accept the RAMU card, a small rectangle of plastic that carries immense dignity. Western observers call this welfare reform, but in the villages, they call it something else, the government that stayed. Because democracy is not only the right to vote once every few years, it is the right to live each day with dignity. But even as systems strengthened and families stood tall again, voices from abroad began to question. Is this progress or isolation? The answer would come not from politicians, but from the people themselves. When a nation begins to rise, the world often looks not with understanding, but with suspicion. In Western newsrooms, the story of Burkina Faso is written in tidy headlines: military rule, frozen aid, geopolitical drift. To them, soldiers in the streets mean repression. Closed borders mean retreat. But those headlines miss the hum of the water pump, the sound of goats on the road, the school bell echoing again across a valley once abandoned. Outsiders see uniforms, locals see safety. They count elections. Villagers count harvests. They talk about democracy. Mothers talk about dignity. And somewhere between those two languages, truth gets lost. For many in Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traore's rise was not a coup, it was a correction. A correction of distance between state and citizen, between talk and toil. His leadership has been called controversial, populist, even dangerous. But the dangerous thing, perhaps, is that it works not perfectly, not everywhere, but visibly. In the preacher's rhythm of this story, this is the moment of revelation. Because here lies the deeper Ibrahim Traore moment. The realization that freedom is not a flag you wave once. It is a field you till every day. And while the Western world debates his legitimacy, a farmer in Gabu simply says, "My children are back in school." That is the quiet revolution the cameras miss. A revolution of endurance, not ego. And yet, Burkina Faso's recovery is not without conscience. Its people know that rights must be protected and that power must answer to justice. But they also know that survival has its own morality, one that cannot wait for approval. Today, as Mali and Niger watch their neighbors' progress, a question spreads across the Sahel like the scent of new rain. What if peace could be built from the farm up? What if aid could create capacity instead of dependency? What if leadership meant solving daily problems, not performing political theater? In one of his speeches, Traore said words that will outlive him. Africa is not asking for pity. We are asking to work. That line, my friends, is thunder wrapped in humility. It is a challenge to the world and a comfort to those who labor. Because in the end, sovereignty is not a spectacle, it is sustenance. The soil, the seed, the goat, the child, these are the true ballots of democracy. They vote, every day, for continuity. So let the pundits talk, let the reports circulate. Burkina Faso is already answering not with arguments, but with action. The plow is their policy, the harvest is their headline. But every movement needs a message. Every message needs a witness. And the witness to this awakening is you. The story of Burkina Faso does not end with applause. It ends with a sunrise quiet, steady, sacred. In the same places where despair once dwelt, the morning now carries the sound of life returning. Guns have gone silent, and in their place rise the humble instruments of peace. Hoes, buckets, plows, and prayer. From the north to the plains of Boucle du Mouhoun, the nation has learned a new rhythm, not of crisis, but of cultivation. This rhythm began with a man who refused to define sovereignty by words alone. He measured it instead in the small victories of daily dignity. This is the heart of the Ibrahim Traore moment, the instant when leadership ceases to be spectacle and becomes service. When a mother sleeps unafraid, when her child walks to class, when a herder grazes his cattle without extortion, that is leadership you can feel beneath your feet. It is the leadership that does not shout. It simply shows up. And to the doubters, to the commentators abroad, who see only the uniform and not the humanity, the Ibrahim Traore reaction has been both patient and profound. To rebuild, to feed, to believe. Because belief, when paired with work, is the purest form of power. Each sack of millet traded, each goat born, each market reopened is a stanza in the nation's new hymn. It sings of endurance, not entitlement, of work, not war. And so we say, Burkina Faso is not just surviving, it is rising. Rising on sweat instead of aid, on seeds instead of speeches, on courage instead of comfort. It is proving that recovery need not be imported. It can be homegrown, watered by willpower, fertilized by faith. And maybe, just maybe, that is the message the world needs now. That sovereignty is not a theory, it is a table where everyone eats. That freedom is not a flag, it is a field where no one starves. That dignity is not a gift, it is a harvest earned together. So when you hear the hum of a water pump in the drylands, remember, that is hope turning its engine. And when you see a child running with a piece of chalk, remember that is peace drawing its own future. If this story moved you, subscribe, share this message, and tell someone that hope still lives in the Sahel, because the world has enough noise. What it needs now is witness.